Fall River, Massachusetts, October 1979. The first body wasn't buried. It was left out in the open, like an invitation. Her name was Doreen Levesque, and she was 17. They found her beneath the football bleachers of a local high school, arms twisted behind her back, skull shattered, clothes torn. Whoever did it wanted her seen, wanted someone, anyone, to understand that this was only the beginning. At first, police assumed it was just another street crime. Fall River was cracking at its seams, its once thriving Milltown spirit swallowed by decay and addiction. Young girls vanished often. Some returned, some didn't. Most were forgotten. But this wasn't just violence. It was a message, and would be followed by more. Within 5 months, 2 more women would die. Their bodies would turn up burned, broken, scattered throughout the woods of Freetown Forest, a place where maps don't help and screams never make it out. At the center of it all, an alleged satanic cult, a young woman who claimed to witness a human sacrifice, and a man some would call the devil himself. His name was Carl Drew, and in the shadow of the Bridgewater Triangle, truth and myth would bleed together until no one could tell the difference. This is the story of murder, manipulation, ritual, and fear. A story buried beneath decades of silence and folklore. A story where the victims are real. The confessions change like shifting shadows. And the devil never needed to show his face to leave a stain. Welcome to Fall River. Fall River was a city bleeding slowly. Once an industrial powerhouse along the Taunton River, the textile mills that had built its wealth now stood like silent tombstones. As jobs vanished, so did opportunity. Entire blocks decayed, windows were boarded up, and young women disappeared into alleys. Some into drug addiction, others into sex work, and some simply vanished. Among the cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights, an ancient kind of fear took root, one that whispered of rituals, blood oaths, and unseen forces gathering in the shadows. On the morning of October 13th, 1979, that fear would take on a physical form. It was cold for October. Maintenance worker Raymond Gannon was making his usual rounds at Diamond Regional Vocational Technical High School, checking the athletic fields before sunrise. He never forgot the way the air felt. Heavier than usual, he told police later, like the whole world had taken a deep breath and stopped moving. At 8:57 a.m., he spotted something beneath the metal bleachers of the football field. It was a girl. 17-year-old Doreen Levesque lay crumpled, her legs splayed unnaturally, her arms bent behind her back as though tied. Her jeans were torn, and blood soaked the gravel beneath her head. Her skull had been caved in, violently and repeatedly. A chunk of concrete was nearby, also stained red. She had been taken, beaten, and left in plain sight. The first officer on the scene, Patrolman Alan Silva, radioed it in as a possible homicide. And within 30 minutes, Detective Paul Carey, a seasoned investigator with Fall River Police Department, was staring down at the girl's body. She wasn't hidden, Carey later recalled. It wasn't about avoiding capture. This was a message. But from who? and to whom remained a mystery. Doreen Levesque had once been a student in New Bedford. She drifted into Fall River months before her murder and began working the streets near Bedford Street and 3rd. Local officers knew her. She was young, troubled, and likely under the control of a pimp. She told friends she'd found protection, but no one knew who it was. That night, witnesses claimed to have seen her around 10:30 p.m. near the bus terminal. She appeared high, nervous, and was seen speaking with a tall man in a dark jacket. Her brutal death shocked the police force, but in the public eye, her murder barely made headlines. She was a teenage sex worker. In 1979, that meant that her life was already halfway written off. But for the investigators still willing to look deeper, her murder didn't look random. Following Doreen's death, street girls began disappearing from their usual spots near Bedford and North Main. Some left town. Others started naming names. Carl Drew, Robin Murphy, Karen Marsden, and Barbara Raposa. They whispered about cult meetings deep in the Freetown Fall River State Forest, about ceremonies, chants, and blood. Detectives heard stories of women being dragged into the woods and told they'd never return. There was talk of a man who believed himself to be a vessel for Satan, of sacrifices, of blood-soaked altars. Most of the girls were addicts, homeless, and few wanted to talk to police, and those who did seemed to be too terrified to tell the full truth. It wasn't just the city that was haunted. Locals had long spoken of the Bridgewater Triangle, a stretch of southeastern Massachusetts infamous for strange occurrences. The triangle included Fall River, Freetown, and Rehoboth. Within it, UFO sightings, strange lights, phantom creatures, and ritual sites left behind in the woods. At the heart of this triangle was Freetown State Forest, a vast, dark expanse where hikers had reported mutilated animals, robed figures, and the remains of burned-out fires surrounded by bones. As Doreen's murder cooled with no suspects, detectives began to wonder, was this really just another street killing, or had Fall River become home to something darker? By early November 1979, the streets were quieter, but not safer. Barbara Raposa had been a sex worker too, though few knew the extent of her involvement. 19 years old, she had a child, a fragile relationship with reality, and a habit of disappearing for days at a time. She was known to police and social workers, but more than anything, she was known to Andy Maltas, a much older man with dark beliefs. On November 7th, Barbara failed to pick up her baby from the babysitter. Friends hadn't seen her. Her usual haunts, downtown Fall River, the strip near Main North, turned up nothing. She had vanished. Maltese was the last to see her. Andrew Maltese was 44, tall, unpredictable, and described by some as a delusional Satanist. A former mental hospital patient, he had a fascination with the occult and a controlling obsession with Barbara. He'd tell people he could conjure spirits, that demons could be made to do your bidding if you paid them in blood, that sex was a sacred exchange, and violence purified the soul. When Barbara went missing, Maltese didn't help search for her. He said she was where she needed to be. Months later, in January of 1980, hunters stumbled on her body in a secluded stretch of the forest outside of Fall River. She had been dead for weeks, possibly months. Her remains were decomposed. Her skull was fractured, and her jaw was dislocated. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. The location, not far from the Freetown State Forest border. Maltese was arrested shortly after, though it took nearly a decade to convict him. But in the meantime, a third girl was already slipping through the cracks. Karen Marsden was 20, street smart, worn down by years of addiction, abuse, and selling her body to survive. She moved between shelters, motels, and back seats. She knew everyone: Barbara, Doreen, and most of all, Carl Drew. Karen didn't just work for Drew, she feared him. In January of 1980, shaken by Barbara's death and certain that she would be next, Karen approached Fall River Police with a story that they didn't know how to handle. She claimed that Carl Drew was the head of a satanic cult operating in Fall River, that he used violence and ritual to control girls like her, that she'd witnessed a human sacrifice in the woods. She didn't name Barbara specifically, but she said that she saw a girl get beaten, her throat slit, and her body left for the devil. Detective Paul Carey, already frustrated by the silence surrounding Doreen's case, leaned in. Karen was terrified. She asked for protection. Police offered to move her to a safe house, but she declined. She said that it was too late. "I'm already dead," she whispered. "He already told me." Carl Drew was unlike Maltese. He wasn't delusional. He was purposeful. A self-styled Satanist and Fall River pimp, he ran his girls with fists, threats, and mythology. He claimed to be the right hand of Lucifer, and according to Karen and others, he demanded rituals in the woods. Robin Murphy, another girl in Drew's circle, would later testify that he used animal sacrifices to initiate followers, that he would chant, draw symbols, and demand blood to prove loyalty. In Drew's world, there was no God. There was only power, and power was taken through fear. Karen said she tried to leave, but Drew warned her what would happen if she did. "He told me I'd end up like the others," she said. On February 9th, 1980, Karen Marsden was interviewed by police again. She was nervous, shifting in her seat, and chain-smoking through the interview. She asked to be dropped off at St. Mary's Church, a quiet stone building where she sometimes sat alone at night. It was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. When she didn't return to the shelter that night, her grandmother filed a missing persons report. Karen's disappearance didn't make headlines, but for detectives like Carey, it was a breaking point. They had 3 girls, all connected, all involved in street work, in Drew's circle, and all had been in fear for their lives. And now, all were dead or gone. In March of 1980, under pressure and perhaps her own fear, Robin Murphy came forward. She told police she had witnessed Karen Marsden's murder in chilling, ritualistic detail. She claimed Drew and another man, Willie Smith, dragged Karen into the woods of Westport, not far from the border of the Freetown Forest. There, they beat her, slit her throat, mutilated her body, and burned parts of her remains in a ritual fire. Murphy said Drew invoked Satan, that he stood over Karen's corpse and proclaimed himself a vessel of the devil. In April, fragments of a human skull were found in the location that Murphy had described. Tests would later confirm it as belonging to Karen Marsden. With Murphy's statement and the remains found, Drew and Smith were arrested. Murphy herself was also charged. She had admitted to participating in the murder. She claimed she was under Carl Drew's spell, that she feared him, that she had no choice. But over the coming months, her story would change and keep changing. She was a witness, then a participant. Then she claimed that she made it all up. By the time the trials began, the line between truth, fear, and invention had blurred completely. Freetown, Fall River State Forest, is over 5,000 acres of dense, tangled wilderness. Paths that lead to nowhere, hills that muffle sound, and a silence so total it crushes thought. It's easy to get lost in the forest, easier still to disappear. On a cold gray morning in April of 1980, a small search team trudged through the underbrush near Reed Road in Westport, just a few miles from the edge of the forest. The location had been provided by Robin Murphy under interrogation. She claimed it was where Carl Drew had brought them to make a sacrifice. There, in the damp soil, beneath a pile of brush and dead leaves, they found what appeared to be pieces of a human skull. Forensic analysis confirmed it. The fragments belonged to Karen Marsden. There were no teeth, no body, just bone shards, singed in places and broken in others. Robin had said that they burned her hair, mutilated her face, and cut off her fingers. The evidence was grotesque, but it matched her story. Detectives stared at the skull pieces in silence. They had their proof. As news of the third murder broke, the press finally took notice, not of the victims, but of the rumors. Reporters latched on to the word satanic, rituals in the woods, blood sacrifices, witchcraft, a cult of prostitutes and pimps in service to the devil. And they had a name for the location, the Bridgewater Triangle. Coined in the 1970s by cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman, the triangle was said to be a paranormal vortex, a place of strange lights, phantom creatures, poltergeist activity, and dark rituals. Freetown State Forest sat near its center, and now 3 murder victims did too. People began calling it cursed. Hikers stayed away. Locals whispered of shadowy figures and symbols carved into the trees. Police officers even admitted, quietly, that they hated patrolling the forest at night. "It's bad ground," one officer reportedly said, "and always has been." Carl Drew was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Karen Marsden. Prosecutors argued that he was a satanic cult leader who argued her death to maintain control of his circle of sex workers, that Karen wanted out, that she was going to talk, and that she had paid with her life. Robin Murphy was the star witness. She testified that Drew believed himself to be a high priest of Satan, that he performed blood rituals, mutilated animals, and promised followers power in exchange for loyalty. She said that she had watched Drew slice Karen's throat, that he kicked her head in, chanting satanic phrases, that they burned her remains as an offering, and it was one of the most shocking testimonies in Massachusetts legal history. But Robin wasn't just a witness. She was also a participant. She was charged with second-degree murder and received a life sentence with the possibility of parole in exchange for her cooperation. Her statement had sealed Drew's fate. But even during the trial, doubts crept in. Murphy changed details of her testimony multiple times. She admitted to lying in the past. Defense attorneys argued that she was manipulating the system to reduce her own sentence, that the entire satanic narrative had been fabricated. There was no physical evidence linking Carl Drew to the murder, only Robin Murphy's word. Still, the jury believed her. Drew was convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. With Drew behind bars and Murphy in prison, Fall River tried to move on, but the questions only multiplied. Who really killed Doreen Levesque? Why did Murphy's story shift so dramatically over time? And was Carl Drew truly a cult leader, or just a violent pimp scapegoated by panic? Even decades later, Murphy would recant portions of her confession. She claimed she lied under pressure, that police coerced her into connecting Drew to the murder, that she, not Drew, had been in control. In one interview, she said, "There was no cult. There was no sacrifice. There was just fear and blood." Investigators returned to the forest in the years following the trials, and they would find stone circles stained with wax, inverted crosses carved into trees, dead animals arranged in ritualistic patterns, and charred bones of unknown origin. As a result of this and the stories surrounding the place, paranormal groups began exploring the forest with spirit boxes and infrared cameras. Some claimed to hear voices whispering. Others caught orbs on camera or recorded screams that weren't audible in person. One investigator left the forest after a session and was found catatonic in their car the next morning. He never returned to the site, and he never would speak about what he saw. The Fall River cult murders didn't exist in a vacuum. By the early 1980s, America was on fire with a new fear: satanic cults. Daytime television exploded with segments warning parents of hidden devil worshippers. Talk shows featured former cult members claiming to have witnessed blood sacrifices and black masses in small-town America. The McMartin preschool case, the West Memphis Three, and books like Michelle Remembers became part of a nationwide hysteria. And at the center of Massachusetts' contribution to the moral panic, Carl Drew. His name became shorthand for the occult, a satanic cult leader who used prostitutes as human sacrifices. Their narrative had it all: sex, murder, religion, youth, and evil. The truth, however, was murkier. Almost immediately after Carl Drew's conviction, critics began to question the integrity of the case. There was no physical evidence linking him to Karen Marsden's death. The entire prosecution rested on the testimony of Robin Murphy, a troubled, inconsistent teen who admitted to lying and changing her story multiple times. Andrew Maltese, convicted of murdering Barbara Raposa, was himself obsessed with Satanism and did admit to performing rituals. But there were no verified cult members, no recovered altars, and no documented rituals beyond what Murphy had claimed. In fact, no one was ever charged for the murder of Doreen Levesque, the first victim. And yet the image stuck. Drew as Satan's soldier, Fall River as a town corrupted by hell. Robin Murphy was granted parole in 2004 after serving just 24 years. She gave multiple interviews over the years, each time altering her story. She once said, "Carl didn't kill Karen. I made that up. I said what they wanted me to say." But then in other interviews, she hinted that Drew did order the murder, that she was scared of him, that the rituals were real. Her flip-flopping became a cornerstone of Carl Drew's appeals, all of which have been denied. Then, in 2011, Murphy violated her parole and returned to prison. She was paroled again in 2023, released quietly with no press. When asked by a reporter if she believed in Satan, she simply said, "I believe in consequences." While the courtroom battles faded, the folklore of the case did not. Freetown State Forest became a hotbed of ghost hunters and paranormal investigators. The murder sites, especially the wooded areas near Reed Road, took on legendary status. Visitors have reported sudden drops in temperature, voices among the trees, equipment failure, and persistent feelings of being watched. Some have claimed to see a woman in white, blood on her mouth, and eyes wide in terror. Others have claimed that they've been followed out of the woods by something that they couldn't see. In 2017, a paranormal team investigating the forest recorded a strange EVP. It came during a session at night, under a full moon, and at the base of a moss-covered stone circle. The voice whispered one word: Karen. Today, the city still bears the scars. The murder sites remain, some redeveloped, others overgrown. Old-timers don't talk about the cult. The local police call the whole episode a case study in how panic feeds perception. But the case still haunts. Books, podcasts, YouTube documentaries, such as the one you're watching now. Investigators still argue whether Drew was a Satanist or a scapegoat, whether Murphy was a terrified girl manipulated by law enforcement, or the true mastermind behind the killings. Most of the original investigators have died. Records have been lost. Witnesses disappeared. But the forest still stands, and for those who walk it, the silence speaks. Carl Drew's last words from a prison interview in 2008 would be, "I'm not a Satanist. I never worshipped anything but survival. But fear made me a monster to them. You can bury the truth. You can even bury the bones. But you can't bury the devil, because people want him to be real." The graves are quiet now. Doreen Levesque, Barbara Raposa, and Karen Marsden, 3 young women lost in the dark corridors of a dying city, tangled in a web of abuse, manipulation, and possibly something more, something ancient. Their stories were used, distorted, and sold. They became symbols of satanic terror in a decade desperate for explanations. But behind every headline, behind every whispered cult, was a human being, frightened, alone, and forgotten. We remember the devil, but we oftentimes forget the dead. Today, locked away at MCI Shirley, Carl Drew remains one of Massachusetts' most infamous inmates. In interview after interview, he has maintained his innocence. "I was no angel. I hit people. I was violent. But I didn't kill anyone. And I didn't worship the devil." He's filed over a dozen appeals, all of which have been denied. His lawyers argue that his conviction was based on flimsy testimony, cultural hysteria, and a justice system eager to make a satanic example out of someone. Each appeal that has been rejected with a single sentence: insufficient grounds to grant retrial. Since her second parole in 2023, Robin Murphy has vanished from the public eye, but her legacy remains one of the most complex in American legal history. She was a witness a confessed participant, a liar, a victim, a manipulator, and possibly the only person who knows the real truth. In a 2006 interview, she was asked one final question. Did you kill Karen Marsden? She looked directly into the camera and said, "We all did. And none of us did." The forest hasn't been forgotten. To this day, the Freetown Fall River State Forest remains one of the most notorious paranormal hotspots in the country. Visitors still report lights flickering deep in the trees, disembodied screams, apparitions matching Karen Marsden's appearance, and ritual sites disturbed as if recently used. Cryptic messages appear on trees, and some still believe that there are cults that meet there in secret, that whatever walked those woods in the 1980s never left. Some nights, people claim to hear chanting echoing throughout the forest, always just out of reach, and always just out of sight. In 2007, a Boston journalist named Elliot Vance visited the forest to write a retrospective on the Fall River cult murders. He was skeptical, hardened, not the kind to believe in ghosts or curses. But when he returned, his demeanor changed. He withdrew from friends, refused interviews, and quit his job. In one of the last public appearances he made, he spoke only a few words. Something is still there, something that never sleeps. I left the forest, but it didn't leave me. He was later hospitalized for acute stress disorder, and he would never speak about Fall River again. Maybe Carl Drew was a cult leader. Maybe Robin Murphy was a murderer. Maybe Karen Marsden saw something that no one else was supposed to see. Or maybe the devil is just a mirror, a reflection of the darkest parts of ourselves, of our fear, of our willingness to believe, of how quickly we can burn someone at the stake when the smoke smells like sulfur. Fall River, 1979, a city of ghosts, bones, and secrets, and maybe, just maybe, one very real devil. Thank you guys so much for exploring this very creepy and dark case with me. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, share it around, leave me a comment, and subscribe if you're new here. You can find my merch and books at mysteryarchives.myshopify.com, and consider becoming a channel member by clicking Join Now, or a patron by visiting patreon.com/mysteryarchives if you'd like to watch all my content ad-free. Aside from all that, my friends, I truly appreciate you all. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you very soon with another new episode. This has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Take care. I'll see you next time.